Welcome, everyone, to the July Broadband Breakfast Club, making the Universal Service Fund into a Universal Broadband Fund. And first, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, ICF International, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the Telecommunications Industry Association, and US Telecom. Please join me in thanking the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Jonathan Charnitsky. Jonathan is the managing editor of Broadband Breakfast. Jonathan began his career as a journalist before returning his focus to law and policy. He is an attorney in Texas and the District of Columbia and has worked previously as a political reporter in political campaign communications and on Capitol Hill. He holds a BA in journalism from the University of Washington and a JD from Villanova Law School, where he focused his studies on internet and intellectual property law and policy. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Morning, everybody. How is everybody doing this morning? Got a packed room this morning. Thank you for attending our breakfast this morning, turning the USF into a Connect America Fund. As the U.S. moves increasingly toward broadband, the Universal Service Fund, which funds the deployment and maintenance of plain old telephone service, or POTS, supports increasingly anachronistic services and has become a poster child for a loophole-ridden, wasteful government spending program. In last year's National Broadband Plan, the Obama administration proposed the eventual conversion of the USF into the Connect America Fund, which would support the deployment and maintenance of subsuming broadband technologies rather than traditional POTS. While unified voices have cropped up calling for USF reform, those same voices quickly divide on the mechanisms by which the system ought to be reformed. Our panel this morning will explore how we got to where we are and where we go from here. So our panelists are, first, Russell P. Hanser, partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer, Michael Speed, senior technical specialist for broadband at ICF International, Hank Hultquist, vice president of federal regulatory at AT&T, Joshua Seidemann, director of policy at the National Telecommunications Cooperative Association, and Daryl West, vice president and director of governance studies at Brookings. Now, I'd like to start off by just asking each of you to give me a little bit of background, or give all of us a little bit of background, on your organizations and kind of where you're coming at USF reform from, and a little bit about where you'd like it to go to. So, if you'd like to start us off, Russell.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm with Wilkinson Barker Knauer, which is a mid-sized telecommunications law firm. So our position naturally is generally the position of our clients. On these issues, my firm tends to represent wireless clients. Wireless clients are particularly concerned, I think, in this area about transitioning. They're certainly supportive of transitioning the fund, supporting broadband. They're concerned about making sure that whatever fund we wind up with recognizes the value that American consumers place on mobility. I think it's no surprise to anyone that wireless broadband subscriptions account for a huge proportion of broadband subscriptions and broadband subscription growth, which indicates something about what consumers want. Our clients are particularly interested in recognizing that wireless services can be a substitute, especially as we move to 4G, can be a substitute not only for traditional fixed broadband services, but also offer that added benefit of mobility. I suspect 95% or more of the folks in this room are carrying some sort of device capable of mobile broadband, have used it in the last few days to use an app or use the web and so forth. Without getting into too much detail, I think these clients are also interested in making sure that we appropriately target funds. Obviously, we want to support broadband, which is expensive, but there's also a lot of support that I think folks in our client base anyway believe is wasteful. Better, as you suggested, geared toward legacy technologies that aren't particularly relevant to everyone sometimes. And then on the inter-carrier comm side, these clients are interested in making sure that rates are reduced, stripped of the internal subsidies that still give rise to arbitrage opportunities, and move to a much lower uniform rate that's less complicated and would promote IP networks and next generation network growth.
Thank you. And It also may help to move around the mics. Feel free to do that, just so we're not making sure we're picking up your voices. Go ahead, Michael.
At ICF International, we're actually we try to be sort of a unbiased party, I guess, in all of this. We actually work with clients on the state side. We work with some carriers, and basically what we're sort of trying to do is to actually kind of help them really determine the impacts on them and how some of the changes that come down may actually impact at the state level, at the carrier level, things like that.
Okay. Joshua?
Hi, good morning. NTCA represents approximately 600 small cooperative telephone companies and commercial companies that serve essentially the places where the larger companies, the Ma Bell, didn't go when they were formed. Universal service has worked. It has done a great job in getting telephone networks out there and broadband capable networks out there. With some adjustments, it can be reformed and support broadband deployment. I know that there's often a lot of talk about waste, fraud, and abuse in the USF fund. The companies that obtain the high cost support, the small companies, their numbers are subject to audit, to checks by NECA, by the FCC. They usually have to wait about 2 years to get reimbursed for any investment in the network. So I think there is some grandstanding that comes about that phrase, and that could probably be laid to rest. The high cost fund has been growing maybe at 3% a year in the past few years. Over the past decade, it's probably been stable if you take into account the declines and the increases. There are certainly spots to capture greater efficiencies. Ultimately, the goal is not just to build broadband, it is to maintain the networks that are out there already. There are surgical measures that could be done to achieve this. We recognize, Russ said there's a great benefit to mobility. At the same time, we need to recognize the complementary relationship between the wired and the wireless services. You need the wired networks to provide the backhaul for your cell phones and PDAs. And I think, at the end, we are committed to working with the industry, with the commission, with policymakers to find a workable solution. And I would, I'm thinking overall we should have as the goal to do it right, not just to do it fast, but certainly it is time to get it done.
Thank you, Josh. And Hank.
So I'm with AT&T. Whole forests have been felled, spelling out AT&T's positions on universal service reform since 2001, and I won't try to even bore you with a summary of those positions. Suffice it to say that AT&T has been working with other members of the industry for a long number of years to try and find ways to reform the universal service system, which I think has some things that it does well and some things that it has not done so well. I do think one of the most important things that the FCC got right, or at least the staff of the FCC got right in drafting the National Broadband Plan, was that it is extremely important to put universal service in a context. And that context is the overall transition that is underway from analog networks to digital broadband networks. I think probably that context gets overlooked too often in this debate, that universal service is the tail, not the dog, on a nationwide network. The purpose of universal service is to bring that network, whatever it is, to areas where it otherwise would not be because the economics are not sufficient. And I think if we keep our eye on that goal of not trying to drive the transition that's underway, but merely to ensure that rural areas participate in that transition, I think we can find a way to accomplish the objectives within the size of the fund that I think most people think is what we can afford.
Thank you, Jonathan. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the internet, so it's appropriate we are discussing broadband here. At Brookings, we just set up a new Center for Technology Innovation a year ago, and I direct that center. We undertake research on broadband, mobile communications, and cloud computing. And we have a online paper series called Issues in Technology Innovation, where we try and bring the latest in research to bear on some of the policy discussions. And a couple months ago, my colleague Jeff Rosen put out a paper entitled Universal Service Fund Reform, Expanding Broadband Internet Access in the United States. And I think the two issues that we're concerned about in this area are, one, increasing access, because certainly we have a need for improving access to universal coverage in this area. 1/3 of Americans still do not have broadband coverage at home. There are huge disparities by income as well as race. You look at Americans earning less than $20,000 a year, only 40% of them have broadband. There are racial disparities here, but then at the same time, we're seeing a huge expansion in terms of mobile communications and wireless phones. So when I think about the policy issues in this area, it makes sense to me to start to reform the Universal Service Fund, to start to shift the subsidies from phones to broadband. I like to give the example of my sister who lives in rural Ohio, so she's like Exhibit A in terms of the problem here. She has a landline, has a mobile phone, and has very slow broadband. And as the government and the private sector are starting to put more and more services online, online tax filing with e-health and m-health, a lot of healthcare applications are going online. She would love to have better access to broadband and access to faster broadband. So I think we need to start making the shift. We need to phase it in so that people who depend on it in rural areas in terms of phone service don't get harmed in the process. But there are many new applications coming through broadband. So if we don't make that transition, those people, if they're just left with phone access, are going to end up being left behind.
Great, thank you, Daryl. And there are definitely some issues that I want to pick apart here in just a moment, especially pertaining to wireless versus wired, pertaining to speed and the notion of whether the tail is wagging the dog on a lot of these issues. But first, let's back up a little bit and jump into sort of a brief history of the USF, just to give us some context in which to place this whole debate. And Russell, I'm going to draw on your experience and ask you, how did we get ourselves into this mess?
How long do we have? So I'll give a very high level how what got into this mess, and there are other folks here who can tell the story as well or better than I. So please jump in. But I guess I'd start by saying, so we developed an intercarrier compensation regime after AT&T was broken up, and we had more and more local providers who are not the long distance provider. So we set up a system where the long distance providers paid money to the local providers. Built into those rates were subsidies, were extra money to help subsidize the cost of local service all over through long distance revenues, which were collected on a sort of nationwide basis. So right from the start, there was extra money in those access charges. As we moved into the 1996 Act era, the Congress wanted to make those subsidies more explicit rather than implicit. And therefore enacted Section 254 of the Act, the section we're still talking about today, which governs the Universal Service Fund, the various subcomponents. I think we're probably talking mostly about high cost and a little bit about low income maybe today, but there are other programs there too. And the idea there was to fund companies directly and squeeze some of that excess out of the access charge rates. But there was still, importantly, some excess in there, particularly on the intrastate side, where it made a lot of political sense for regulators to keep access rates on the interstate side high. So we moved into the Section 254 regime where subsidies were more explicit. But the 1996 Act, as we all know, is very much concerned about competition as well, and therefore adopted a fairly, or at least as it was interpreted, adopted a fairly liberal stance as to who could get money and how much money folks would get. So in the early stages especially, there was a liberal look at competitors getting funding, And there was also, with apologies to Josh, a liberal approach to the money given to rural providers. There was an idea that sort of they'd get more support, but it would be phased down over time to the same level that others got. As time went on, the way the politics works, we can see this today in sort of the debt negotiations, it's harder to cut back when you've said you're going to cut back than you plan to, and we didn't cut back as much. Wireless and other competitive services proliferated, and the Universal Service Fund did a great job at supporting that competition, but the fund grew as a result. At the same time, the contribution base declined a little bit because the contribution system we developed was based on what we call the revenues-based system, and it effectively goes after revenues associated with telecommunications services and private carriage telecommunications, and increasingly there's question about whether a particular offering is that kind of service and whether the associated revenues should give rise to contributions. So we've had and I should say more and more communications have moved to email and other platforms that are not subject to contribution. So we've had pressure on the contribution base and expansion on the distribution side, and that's what's led to a lot of the issues we're discussing now on universal service. Now, of course, as has been said, we've also moved from an analog narrowband world to a world where we want to support digital broadband service, and that's very important. And I should say we still have substantial subsidies in the access charge rates, which have given rise over the years to a lot of different arbitrage schemes which suck money out of the system that might otherwise be used for other things. So it was the ISP-bound traffic in the late 90s and early 2000s and even mid-2000s. Now the talk is mostly about traffic pumping, but these are all schemes that develop because you can earn more for delivering traffic than it costs you to deliver it.
Okay, great. And Michael, let me prompt you to jump from there and just give us a brief summary of where we are with USF reform right now.
I think with currently, we're at the point where we've had Congress has prompted they prompted the FCC to actually draft a national broadband plan. We've gone through. We have that broadband plan. We have an NPRM out there to actually reform USF from being pretty much a supporting telephone infrastructure to actually supporting our new broadband infrastructure. And basically, there are a lot of good reasons for this, as were mentioned. One of them is, the high growth of the fund. There are concerns about sustainability. There's also some concern that the original regulations, which were drafted about 15 years ago, now are basically they've been outpaced by technology. So currently, we're at the point where there has been a lot of movement, and obviously we're all here talking about it. There are a lot of commercial and federal stakeholders that are talking about it, probably in other places as well. So we've gone through having the NPRM come out, having reply comments, and we're getting to the point where I believe, at least, that there will be some sort of movement. And I think it kind of makes sense. I mean, the market exists, the consumers are out there, they want broadband. I mean, in a decade, we've grown from 8 million to 200 million users. And, we've seen movement on, again, the federal side. We've also seen significant commercial and federal investments that have already been made through private companies, but also through, the BIP and BTOP programs that we've talked about here before. And I've actually been traveling around the country. I've met with various state officials, carrier representatives. I've been to the FCC open meetings, so everyone's on board to either to basically do something and to move forward with something. I think the devil's really in the details, and that's what people are trying to figure out now. I also think that the carriers that are out there and the state officials really realize that some sort of change is coming, and I think it's really important that they actually try to get out in front and really kind of assess or determine for themselves what these changes and impacts will actually be. There's going to be some sort of change, and with change, you have the opportunity to actually take advantage of certain benefits that might come with it, and you have to really go out and address risks that could pop up and impact you. And so I think that's what, I think that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of all of this.
Great. And I'm going to revisit what movement means and when you think it's coming in a little bit. But let me jump into the structural complications with moving toward a broadband fund from a universal service fund a little bit. And you've got telephone service, which is relatively easy to define. I mean, in the past, it was a copper wire. You had point A, point B. Broadband, on the other hand, takes all sorts of forms. And it takes wired forms and it takes wireless forms. How do you think, and I'd like to hear from each of you on this, how do you think the Connect America Fund should address these issues, and how will that play out structurally in a finished form? So anyone who wants to jump in on that, I'll see who's most eager.
Sure. I actually think this is a really good question that isn't internalize the implications of it often enough. In the old world, in the analog PSTN world, we had a technology that was fairly uniform in terms of telephony. We had a business model that was fairly uniform in terms of you had this thing called basic local exchange service. You had this other thing called long distance service. And then you had, as Russ described, you had a rate design model that incorporated contribution from end users, from inter-exchange carriers, and from Universal Service Fund in the wake of the 1996 Act. So you had a very uniform kind of structure. And in broadband, you've got wild variations in technologies, even among phone companies. You have VDSL, fiber to the home, ADSL 2+. You have this whole plethora of technologies, even just on the wireline phone company side, never mind when you bring in DOCSIS, LTE, HSPA, HSPA+. There's just a great diversity of technologies. And then there's also a great diversity of business models. I mean, the business model for broadband is not a single thing. You've got people out there with various usage allowances. You've got people out there with unlimited. You've got different speed tiers. So it is a much more heterogeneous world, whether from a technology perspective or from a business model perspective, than the telephony world was and is. And I think that adds a tremendous complication. So how do you deal with that? I mean, I think what AT&T has said is one of the ways in which you deal with that is you move the universal service model from what was basically a model of public utility regulation, where everybody gets basically the same service for some, regulated price, to a model that looks more like a procurement model, where the authorities go out and they identify the areas where a subsidy is needed, and they identify a provider that will agree to perform whatever they define as the obligations of the universal service recipient. That provider says, okay, yes, I'll take that funding in exchange for those obligations for this area. And I think that is one of the key components of dealing with this heterogeneity problem that you've identified.
Daryl, I see you nodding down there.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add to what Hank has said is, the big problem, I think, is rural access. It's both the policy problem and the political problem. It's a political problem in Congress because legislators from rural areas, see the current fund as benefiting their area and their people, and they don't want to give up access to this. And so the idea that I would put on the table to add to what Hank has said is to add a consumer choice component to whatever the new configuration is. And I think this is particularly relevant for the low-income program that serves people below the federal poverty line. That you could basically give consumers who are eligible under the guidelines of that program a choice between assistance for the landline, which is the current system, a mobile phone, if that is their preference, or broadband access. Because when I think about my sister, she would be content today with a combination of a mobile phone and higher speed broadband. Why should we in Washington try and decide what those consumers want? Why don't we give them the choice to basically, if they are eligible for subsidized service, that they can choose in what form that service takes based on their particular needs?
I think we've kind of mentioned before that we've mentioned the high cost program, the low income program, and there are a couple other programs under universal service, the schools and libraries program and the rural healthcare program. And those two programs specifically go out and basically carriers come in and bid on bids that are placed out there. And so you end up getting low-cost service to a designated anchor institution. And I kind of agree that maybe something like that should be the model that we push towards, having some sort of technology-neutral platform where carriers can come in and actually bid, much like the reverse auction that they're talking about under CAF. One concern that I might have with a consumer-based choice is that you might provide too many options, and that might actually increase the size of the fund. I think with the existing high-cost fund you had mentioned before with wireless carriers and competition, that I think that might have been, that's one of the things that people have said has actually added to the growth of the fund, having different options out there available.
I'm glad Hank spoke to the difficult policy questions that arise, so that leaves me to discuss the very easy legal questions that are implicated. The first one is that when you read at first blush Section 254 of the Act, it limits universal service support to telecommunication service, and broadband is defined by the FCC as an information service. Now, the Supreme Court has said that the Telecom Act is not a model of clarity. And there are ways to read the Act, and you can get the support for advanced services, which is a category beneath which broadband would fall. So there's that legal hurdle to be met, and I think it can be, but it needs to be done in a way that withstands judicial review rather. The second mechanical element is trying to define, and Russ, you had alluded to this in terms of how the states and the federal government split responsibility to support networks. By definition, broadband is an interstate service. So really all that falls on the federal side. How do we capture state involvement? How do we get states to feel and to get some skin in the game? Because I don't think that it can be supported totally on the federal side. And then you look at the internet, and with a telephone network, it's easy to determine what's a local call and what's a long-distance call. Once you get into broadband, that's, again, some review, some analysis needs to be done in order to crack that nut. I think they can be, but the trick is going to be to do it in a way that passes muster and floats through the appeals court unscathed.
Russ, I'm going to turn this one over to you, but let me just pose a question, I guess, to both of you then. Does that mean, and this is something that I personally like to push, a revision of the Telecommunications Act? I mean, do we need to go in before we set up a Connect America Fund and really clarify the Act? And I mean, that opens up a whole host of other issues, whether you say yes or no. But let me pose that, and then Russ, let you address what Josh had said.
So on that, I would say, do we need to? I think probably no. And I say that for two reasons. So first, Josh mentions the question about whether Section 254 permits support for broadband. I think, and it sounds like Josh mostly agreed with this, I think that it can be read to support it. Hank's company, AT&T, about a year and a half ago, put out a 10-page or so paper examining this issue, which I thought was persuasive. The bottom line is Section 254 at times seems to be limited and at other times doesn't seem to be. That's, to me, a textbook ambiguity, the kind of issue on which an expert agency generally would get deference. On top of that, as many of you know, in the net neutrality order last year, the Commission adopted an expansive view of what's known as Section 706. It's actually 706 of the Telecommunications Act, not of the Communications Act, but that's a legal wonk thing. So I don't know if that interpretation will be upheld in the court when the order is ultimately published in the Federal Register and challenged, but if it is, that rationale is actually probably much stronger with respect to universal service than with respect to the ends to which it was put in the order. So that's on the distribution side. And then on the inter-carrier compensation side, which is really intricately intertwined here, I think there's a very strong argument the FCC could pull all arrangements within the scope of Section 251b5, which is now known as the which is the reciprocal compensation provision, which now is generally understood to cover only local traffic. But the commission for 5 years or so has flirted with the idea that maybe it really should be interpreted to cover all. So do you have to? No. That's not to say that we shouldn't, though. There are ambiguities. Ambiguities do lead to court challenges. Court challenges lead to uncertainty. Uncertainty kills investment. So there might be good reason to have legislation that clarifies some of these issues.
Okay, and let me jump back then to kind of a compilation of what was said earlier regarding a procurement model, regarding consumer choice, and regarding the inflation of the fund. Where does one draw the line? Where is an economically feasible but also utilitarian place to draw the line where we get a fair amount of consumer choice, where people, I mean, because the difference between just even if you're looking at a very high level, wired and wireless internet is tremendous. I mean, they are two, even though you get the same thing on your device, they're two very different services, I think. How do you ensure that there is consumer choice, but not so much consumer choice that you end up with a huge bloated fund, which is the problem that we're trying to stem in the first place?
I think it's not going to be uniform. I mean, consumers do and will have a lot of choice. You know, AT&T has said that after we complete the merger with T-Mobile, we will put in place plans to deploy 4G wireless service to 97% of the country. And so that means the vast majority of consumers are going to have multiple choices of wireless, wireline, satellite. There are going to be, you know, there's always the proverbial person who lives on the mountaintop who it is just extremely difficult to serve. And I don't think within again, 254 creates a balancing of universal service objectives. It's not just a unilateral, we must bring at all costs the same technology everywhere and the same choice everywhere. It sets up a balancing that says, yes, we should have reasonably comparable services in rural and high-cost areas to the services that are available elsewhere. But at the same time, we don't want to end up with the contribution factor being so high that it becomes a barrier to the adoption and use of these services. So I think in that balancing act, we have a very good chance, if we do this right, of landing in a world where most consumers have, you know, quite a sufficient number of choices in this area. And then, you know, for the proverbial person at the top of the mountain, we do the best we can within the constraints that the Act places.
The NPRM kicks off the possibility at bottom to have in each market, one model would be to have one mobile provider and one wireline provider. And I agree with Hank, and I've done, since hopping aboard at NTCA, I've gone out to visit some of our members. There are some markets where you'd have to make a really, really strong case to support two providers of the same sort. And it could be a proverbial grocery store in a small town. If you open a second one, it could cannibalize the other. I don't know where to draw the line. There should be a model in place, you know, in terms of, you know, how do we do that sort of analytical construct. But I think at baseline, the principle should be recognized that there are going to be instances, the man on the mountain, where it doesn't make policy sense, it doesn't make a lot of economic sense to really support multiple providers in one single area.
Darrell's point, Josh's point, I think also has important implications for what Darrell was saying about, I don't think Darrell used the word, but sort of a voucher kind of ish system where consumers are given, you know, credits, let's say, that they can use towards service. In an area where there truly is a natural monopoly, that kind of system doesn't work, right? That's why markets don't work in natural monopolies, because no provider can sort of capture sufficient market share to economize and, you know, capitalize on economies of scale. So I think in those true natural monopoly areas, that poses a big problem. But I think one of the interesting nuances of the current iteration of this debate is a recognition that maybe was lacking in some of the previous iterations of this debate, that there's natural monopoly areas and there's natural monopoly areas. There's really super high cost areas and there's other areas. And I think consistent with what Hank was saying, we have to sort of recognize the gradations. And there are areas that we have thought of as high cost areas where it turns out there are one or more competitive providers offering service without subsidy. that matters, right? And there are areas that will never see that, or at least will not see that currently. But the history of this industry is a history of natural monopoly ceding way to competition in areas where people might not have expected it. And ultimately, I'm not sure this is the right place in the discussion to say it, but it follows from what I just said, so I will. I mean, ultimately, the Universal Service Program, the grant programs, no government program we have is ever going to funnel as much money into broadband deployment as the market. And what we need to do first and foremost is make sure we are opening up opportunities to put capital in those networks for companies like Hank's and Josh's members to put money into those markets. And we need to use universal service to fill the gaps. But we need to always keep in mind, sort of when we're doing other things in the policy space, we're working on the issues that you probably talk about in this room other weeks and months, that we have the universal service objective in mind, because every telecom policy is a universal service policy as well as whatever it is.
The other thing I would throw into this discussion is, I don't think we should have this discussion in isolation from the broader deficit reduction discussion that's going on, because we can talk about ways to reform the Universal Service Fund. There's some members of Congress who have proposed taking $1 billion out of the fund basically to reduce the deficit, and perhaps capping the program at the current year level as well. And so we have to be cognizant of the looming threats that are out there that could transform the revenue that's available to do any of these things, given the larger deficit issue that we're facing.
The deficit issue is actually, there's a bit of a disconnect. Sure, the deficit issue demonstrates a bit of a disconnect because the USF doesn't come out of general revenues. Those are funds and fees paid from one company essentially to another. It gets washed through the Universal Service Administrative Company, but that never comes from general revenues collected by a taxing authority of the United States. So using USF for deficit reduction is more of reaching into an envelope that was never designated as a tax dollar and using it for those purposes.
Any other reactions on that?
I think Josh raises, I won't pretend that I know exactly what the substance of the deficit, the debt ceiling negotiations are. But there has been a lot of this talk about this $1 billion, and I think Josh raises that there are definitely legal issues with that that are not, at least by me, are not well understood. But there is a sort of a broader, I think, almost again context that comes with these negotiations and these discussions. Is it reinforces the point that I made a few minutes ago about 254 having a balancing, that there are not unlimited means to bring about our goals in universal service, and it might be a great thing if we had the means to bring fiber to the home to every house out there through the Universal Service Fund, but the cost of that would be quite high, and I think much more than would be either within the context of the balancing of 254 or given the overall discussion that's occurring in Washington, to think that you could dedicate that amount of resource to that problem, I think is wholly unrealistic.
I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, let me just move on to the issue of speed. The current definition of broadband is I think 3 megabits per second. Does anyone know this? 4? Okay. So, thank you, Rahul. So, as we're looking at technologies advancing and we're looking at moving toward, this quote-unquote gigabit nation, apps that require significantly more speed than we currently have, how do we take this into account when building a Connect America fund? Again, this is not plain old telephone service where you're connected or you're not. How do we account for if we're building a network that's at 4 megabits per second, and then all of a sudden 2 years down the road we find that, 6 megabits per second or 10 megabits per second is really what you need to, as a speed to be substantially called broadband technologies. How do we build this into a Connect America fund so it will take into account this advancement in technology?
This is going to be the new digital divide in America. I mean, right now we think about the digital divide in terms of those who have access to broadband versus those who don't. The next generation argument is those who have access to low-speed broadband versus those who have access to high-speed. And as you point out, there are many applications coming online that are going to require significantly higher broadband speed. I mean, I always have a personal illustration of this because at Brookings, we have 45 megabits per second of speed. I go home, and it's like 5 to 10. And what I can do at home is much more limited, obviously. And so, it's something that when we're thinking about ways to deal with the access question, the speed element actually becomes a crucial distinguishing factor.
So I think this is, a great, if I put this in the context of the way I am thinking about universal service, that, the government has to decide what kinds of performance they want, and then they have to provide an adequate subsidy for these areas where the private capital will not provide that kind of network. I mean, my view is the right policy approach for the policymakers is for them to make a decision. What applications do people need? What kind of performance do those applications require? What can I reasonably foresee? And frankly, what is affordable within the context of the kind of funding that is likely to be available for that purpose? And the policymakers have to balance those things and find the best answer they can to those questions. I'm not going to pretend I know what that answer is. Is it 4? Is it 3? Is it 6? This to me is a question that needs to be answered by policymakers, and industry needs to be prepared to then in turn say, okay, yes or no, I'm willing to do that, deploy that network in exchange for the revenues I'll get from my customers and the subsidy you're offering for this high-cost area.
The question needs to be answered by policymakers, but certainly with the input of the folks who understand the technical parameters of whatever network will be deployed. I think we're in there's a certain sweet spot right now in terms of if companies can get fiber into the ground, because what it requires is the addition of electronics to boost the capacity. And I don't remember who did the analysis, but there was an analysis done that demonstrated that most of the cost of deploying fiber, copper, any wire in the ground is labor. And in today's copper market, copper is actually more expensive than fiber. So without addressing a particular technology as the basis, I think the threshold question is what sort of a network can almost be future-proof? What sort of a network provides the most today that we can then build on for the future?
And I'd have to add that I think it is important that we try to build for the future, but we also have to realize too that some of the areas that they're talking about serving, I mean, initially with CAF, they're talking about serving unserved areas, so areas that don't have broadband at all. And so while I agree with the concept of a minimum national standard, I think it's important to actually try to figure out what it is you're actually going to be using that network for. What are the major uses? Is it going to be education? Is it going to be healthcare? Is it going to be to spur economic growth and business development? And that might be something that's I think that is something that's best said at the government level. And I think that then as Hank said, you do allow companies to come in and say, I can provide it for whatever level of monies that you have available, or I'm not interested.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add to what's been said. I'll just say that, so I have Fios at my home in Fairfax. Fios is great. Fios is not, I suspect, the 45 megabits that Brookings has. As between funding, giving funding to me to get up to 45 and giving funding to someone in Iowa who wants to get to 4, that's a fairly easy choice, right? I get it. No, I mean, they get it. And as between, it's really, I'm really happy that the telemedicine point got brought up, because, as between making sure that someone in a rural area can get access to the very best medical care, where that may require 10 megs or something, that's really important. So I think the question, so I agree with what's been said, that we should define it in terms of what are the capabilities that we want. And it seems like for now, the kind of capabilities we want are roughly satisfied by 4 down and 1 or a little less than 1 up. That seems to be the number that's thrown around as enabling me to have a telephone conversation, watch high definition video, and surf on Facebook. So maybe we want a little more, as I think Josh indicated. fiber networks are, in one sense, future-proof. It's really a matter of changing the electronics on the end. So I'm not saying we should just build for exactly what we need today, but we should remember this is sort of a stopgap. USF is a stopgap. USF is not it shouldn't be what gets me in Fairfax from 10 megs to 45.
Let me squeeze in. Nice catch. Let me squeeze in one more question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. Let me flip that coin then and ask whether, if we can't accomplish these speeds, if we can't accomplish 4 or 6 or 10, is that then going to keep the policymakers from changing the definition? And do we end up kind of dragging the pace of advancement when we're even right now trying to catch up to the rest of the world, according to many folks? If we say, well, there's no way we're going to be able to give everybody 6 megabits per second, so let's just keep it at 4. Is there a danger there?
So I think the answer is if you made a decision and that was your permanent decision for all time, the answer would be, yeah, that sounds like a real danger. I think that gets back to part of this program as we reform it, as we change this model. It has to be that this set of obligations that are accepted are a set of obligations for a period of time. That these are not the perpetual obligations, that the provider, that there's an end date to those obligations and that there will be a revisiting and a decision will be made that the world has changed, that now use cases have evolved which require a higher level of performance. And as a country, it's important to us to now expand this definition in some way. To pretend that you can make the right decision once and forever, I think, is really the risk that arises if you start to think about the problems you've identified, Jonathan. And my hope would be that the policymakers would not, and that they would recognize this as a decision that's made for a period of time, and then at some future point in time, we'll revisit it. A lot of things might have changed. Maybe, as Russ said, these areas that we thought were natural monopoly areas, some of them won't be. There will have been competitive entry in some of them, and we'll decide, well, you know what, that area, we don't really need a subsidy in that area anymore. Let's focus on the areas where we do, and let's update the definition to meet the current and reasonably foreseeable needs.
Let me just add quickly, from the legal perspective, that's exactly what the Commission is charged with doing. So the Act defines universal service as an evolving level of service. That statute has baked into it the idea of revisitation, tinkering, and hopefully sort of upward mobility in what our aspirations are.
Russ, I'm sorry, but you said what I was going to say.
I retract.
No. I think Russ hit the nail on the head, and I think Hank illustrated perfectly. The statute says in universal service, it's an evolving level of services. One thing that could be done to make sure that we stay on track is for the FCC to actually say, something, we need to revisit this on a scheduled periodic basis, and not just, take an ad hoc approach to when we're going to revisit what the proper speeds or the proper modes of deployment are.
And one thing I'd just like to add is that if we do move towards a CAF reverse auction type system, then the logical conclusion might be to actually just revisit it right before you do the next auction. And so when you go to reassess what support that area might need, you also revisit what the national standard might be at that time. Because as we've seen, it's been 15 years and technology's advanced drastically and the regulations had a tough time keeping pace. So if we have a simple mechanism for them to actually do that revisit and actually verify that that's really where we should be at, then I think that it'll help us going forward.
Daryl, anything to add down there?
No.
Okay. Let me then open it up to the audience if anyone in the audience has questions that they'd like to ask. And if you could please identify yourself and stand up.
Kelly Bowen. I'm the government relations guy for Conterra. We're a rural broadband provider, big pipe provider. We play in the E-rate, we play in the telehealth, we do backhaul for cell phones and so on. The point I was going to bring up is that we see, and everyone sees, that telecommunications is becoming irresistibly an IP-based service. And when you're in an IP-based service and you're running Ethernet, everything is payload. There is no voice, there is no data, there is no video. It's just payload. Some payloads pickier than others, video and voice being two. So if you're running an asynchronous thing, you have issues. But if you're a satellite guy, you have worse issues. The bottom on this is we've kicked around the idea just for fun because we do play in E-rate, we do play in telehealth, we do basically bid broadband to end users. Rather than fooling around with all of these artificial constraints and worrying about Title I and Title II, which are irrelevant anymore, why don't we just say we're going to provide 100 megs, we'll provide broadband to the end users in 20 meg increments. Everybody gets 20. If they can't afford it, we'll subsidize it. If they want more than 20, we'll just charge them for it. Of course, the problem is there's about $1 trillion worth of sunk investment out there in carrier technologies that aren't very good for IP. But that might be a better goal in the long run rather than trying to figure out how to milk obsolete plant for another 90 years.
I don't, I think at least from a lot of the conversations from up here, I don't think anyone's looking to try to milk obsolete plant for 90 years. I think, I think a lot of people around, and just from conversations I've had, again, at like state carrier levels, I think people recognize that there needs to be some sort of change. I'm not sure that, and I obviously haven't done the study for 20 megs to everybody, but, I'm at this time, since there is a lot of concern about growth of fund and actually raising, potentially going over where the fund's at right now and contribution factors and things like that. I'm not sure that 20 megs, I'm not sure the cost implications of it, but I think what I've seen from talking to people is that everyone recognizes that something does need to change. And so I think that that'll probably happen. I'm not sure if it'll be 20 megs, but it'll be something.
So, I mean, I think it raises, practical questions ultimately. The, that kind of, I thought Josh made a great point earlier when he was talking about, sort of the civil engineering being one of the main cost drivers here, and it reminded me of one of my sort of favorite little sayings that we have, which is that Moore's Law does not apply to digging ditches. And when you look at 20 meg as an example, I mean, at AT&T, that's a service we provide. A capability, we call it UVerse. It's really VDSL, and so basically you have to get the copper length down, inside of 5,000 feet to be able to do that. And in these more rural areas, when you start looking at the distribution areas and how far some of the homes are, the living units from any sort of nodal central point, that's a lot of ditches you have to dig to get down to 5,000 or less copper lengths, and so it drives a lot of costs. So ultimately, it's a question of, within the overall constraints, what can you achieve, and is 20 megabits everywhere feasible? I thought, so the point that was made earlier about maybe looking at this more in a more finer gradation might make some sense. There may be some places where 20 megabits is quite achievable, but there are others where it's going to be quite costly.
Anyone else like to add to that? Okay, I think we have a question here and then one more over here.
Hi, my name is Agatha. I'm a law student and also an intern at the NTIA. I was wondering what each of your thoughts are on the reverse auction mechanism for distributing the high cost fund, whether you're in favor of it or opposed to it, and why.
So just from a pure auction design perspective, I mean, auctions will tend to work better in places where you have multiple bidders. I would say my expectation would be that's more likely in unserved areas than in areas that currently have some, someone's already deployed. Having the effectiveness of an auction in an area where you have a provider, let's say, who's received subsidies under the existing system, and you're trying to figure out, how do we get off of that existing system and onto a new? I think the auction design is difficult for those areas. So in general, I think it would be useful for the FCC to get some experience with reverse auctions first in unserved areas, and think about other possible fund design parameters for areas where you have someone already providing service.
When you're talking certainly in an area where somebody already provides service, it implicates the issue of stranded investment. In any area, one of the boogeymen of a reverse auction is that toward the end of the auction term, does that provider have an incentive to invest anymore? Because term's going to be over, they may as well be out of the market soon. The other theological question that comes up is whether it drives efficiencies or whether it drives a race toward the least capable, toward the bottom line network. I know that there are areas, greenfields, where auctions have been done around the world, and Hank said that could be a testing ground perhaps, but there are, certainly in an area that's served by an existing provider, there's just an awful lot to consider, and the auction does not seem to be a good result.
I would think if one of the goals, and this is what's all over the National Broadband Plan, is to actually have sort of a technology neutral approach and something that can evolve over time. I think that right now the high cost fund's done a great job of actually supporting telecommunication services for over a decade, but we're getting to a point where we need new technology. There have been significant technological advancements and the fund just hasn't been able to keep up with that. So while reverse auctions may not be the perfect methodology, I think it is important to actually pilot them out, test them out, see if they can work in those areas. Because right now we do need to actually allow for a fund that can actually evolve and kind of grow. And that goes not only for the technology, but also, as we kind of mentioned before, that minimum national standard. That kind of needs to grow and evolve over time. And for a lot of rural carriers that are currently receiving high cost support that exist in these areas where potentially there isn't competition, you would think that in that type of system, they might have a natural advantage. They've already deployed a system, they've already built it. For people that may have won an auction, then potentially they've already built a system as well. So their costs coming in the next round of the auction probably would only be operations cost, might be lower, unless there's some sort of significant new technology that can come in there, or business model that can come in there and serve it for even cheaper.
Answer at a slightly higher level, and previous speakers have spoken about the auction design issues, and clearly there are auction design issues, and I think they are particularly difficult here, maybe more difficult, probably more difficult here than in the spectrum context, given sort of the sunk investments and all. But I'd say, as an idea, it's an idea we should pursue. So traditionally we've had two ways of figuring out how much a recipient needs in support. One way is tell us how much you're spending, and we'll audit and make sure you should be spending roughly that amount, and then we'll make sure you get back that plus a little profit. That's the rate of return model. There's debate about how well that works, but I think in sort of academic circles, there's a wide view anyway that there are a lot of problems there, and that there's not a great incentive toward efficiency in that model. The second model has been, we're going to try to figure out how much it should cost you, not necessarily even using your own plant, but in using some idealized version of plant. We went through a period in the late 90s and early 2000s of developing and applying very, very complicated cost models and computer simulations designed to figure out what costs would be. That has its own significant problems. There's a lot of administrative expense. There's a lot of inaccuracy. It's hard. We live in a large, complex country, topographically complex and geographically complex, and complex in terms of population. So there's a lot of cost in developing that. So the appeal of reverse auction is let's let the people who know best what their costs are reveal their costs under a system that prompts them to reveal their costs by bidding in a way that will get them money if they're sort of right and can do it for the least cost. So I wouldn't dismiss the idea of reverse auctions just because there's auction design issues that have to be faced, because we have to recognize that the alternatives are not ideal either.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Stephanie Joyce. I'm from Arent Fox, the DC office. We've spoken a lot about the payout and the auction design, et cetera, but I'd like to touch on something that Russ aptly observed earlier this morning, which is that the contribution base is shrinking. And the FCC, I think, put a Band-Aid on that issue by imposing USF on VoIP, which I maintain was of questionable legality, but I lost that appeal. Nonetheless, can any of you speak to some of the other contribution mechanisms that have been discussed? For example, the end user would pay directly per voice grade channel that they use or per telephone number that they use. Speak to any aspect, the legality, the efficiency, the feasibility of those options.
So we've been around every possible contribution base, I feel like. And so we have a rule in our office, which is anytime you have a meeting to talk about contribution, the first thing everybody has to say is, there's no perfect answer. We've looked at sort of connection-based approaches such as you've described. We got ourselves very comfortable with a telephone number and connection-based. I think the real challenge is when you're talking about, really in this context, changing universal service from a program that supports phone service to a program that supports broadband, the hard question to answer is, well, what industry or industries is the set of beneficiaries from that deployment? And is there a way to come up with a simple, fair way of, and within the statute, which just adds the degree of difficulty, of having the beneficiaries of the deployment contribute to the Universal Service Program? And I'll be quite frank, I have not heard such a way as yet within all of those constraints, simple, fair, and within the statute, recognizing what industries are the beneficiaries of this deployment, to come up with an answer to that problem. So I think it is one that is very difficult. We certainly hope that the FCC will, after completing reform of the distribution mechanism and intercarrier compensation, move on to getting together. So how do we build consensus around contribution reform? Because I think it's really important. But as your question implies, I think it is very difficult.
Raised a great number of sets of issues, but at bottom, we need to look at broadening the base, figuring out how to do that with the state, whether it's numbers-based or connections-based. But I think at bottom, it's time really to kick this out where it's not just the industry each tossing a proposal over the fence that falls into a box, but it's time to involve the policymakers and to start really studying this and to move on it and start making a decision.
And as your question pointed out, and as Hank also noted, it's like when you try and define who are the industries who are benefiting. I mean, in our center, we work with a lot of different companies. It's no longer technology companies that are doing technology innovation. They're companies interested in education, in publishing, in healthcare, in public safety. I mean, virtually the entire economy. And so that then creates the problem in terms of answering your question.
So two things. First, I want to say Stephanie and I are adverse in litigation, so I want to point out that she called my comment apt. Oh, maybe not in any, okay. But more to the point, I just wanted to say, so I left the commission about 5.5 years ago, and maybe 6 months after I left, I had lunch with another person who had left around that time. A bunch of people left around that time. And I said, I had no idea. The thing that surprised me most is how much time I spend for clients figuring out, is this cool new offering they've got or that they're going to have an information service or a telecommunications service? And the reason they want to know is not because they're worried about CPNI or Section 202A. The reason they want to know is they want to know, do I have to charge an extra 15% so I can contribute to the USF? I'd say that work has, since entering private practice, has probably been 10 to 15% of, well, maybe let's say 10% now of my work. And when I told this person that, he had the exact same reaction, that he was doing a lot of that work too. And almost every time I've talked with somebody who, in my general sort of sphere on these issues, they have the same story. That's great for my daughter's college fund. That's not great for the industry. That's not great, having to spend all this time figuring this out is not great, and we're going to have more and more of those issues, and the fact that they are an impediment precisely where we want to have the least impediments, that is in the area of newfangled cool services that mix communications technology and computing power, is worrisome. So that's not an answer. That's not saying we should go to numbers, we should go to connections, but that's saying, just as I said before, there are costs to our current distribution approach. There are costs that we should recognize in our current contribution approach.
Hi, I'm John Windhausen. I represent a coalition of schools, health, and libraries that are seeking better broadband connections. And I'd like to ask you about the inclusion of these anchor institutions in the Connect America Fund. The National Broadband Plan called for 1 gigabit connections to anchor institutions as a goal, but the FCC didn't establish a particular proceeding to accomplish that goal. Rather, it told us to look for opportunities in each individual proceeding that the FCC might be going forward with. So we were a little disappointed that the FCC's proposed Connect America Fund only talked about residential and didn't talk about the needs to provide high-capacity bandwidth to these anchor institutions. And so we filed comments asking for the broadband or for the Connect America Fund to be reformed to encourage the build-out to these anchor institutions. So my question is it possible in your negotiations that you're looking at to reform the inter-carrier compensation system and create the funding for the Connect America Fund, that the broadband needs of these anchor institutions could be folded into that so we can get high-capacity broadband connections in these rural areas? And before you answer that E-rate is supposed to take care of this, just a reminder, E-rate is primarily to compensate the monthly recurring costs, not the build-out costs. So we're looking for some help with the build-out costs. Thanks.
Thanks, John, for that question. I think I have no comment on these negotiations that you refer to. But I think your question is an interesting one. One of the frustrating things to me, this question was raised about, do we have with the statute we need? And so when I look at 254 is really a service-based approach to universal service. And what I think the real universal service problem is an infrastructure problem. It's not a service problem. I would rather have a world where we had infrastructure objectives, we achieved those objectives, and the parties then could offer whatever services they wanted and we over the infrastructure that we had achieved. So that to me is one of the sort of what I see as one of the weaknesses of the statute, and in a perfect world, that would be one of the things I would try to think about. Is there a different way of building universal service around infrastructure rather than services? I think, again, going within the context of the high cost fund as a standalone funding mechanism, I guess I would say I tend to think that given all the objectives we have and the things that we're trying to are trying to be balanced here, I am skeptical that there can be enough money found to achieve all of those objectives and also create some new program that focuses on bringing gigabit services to anchor institutions. And that's disappointing, because I think that's a really important infrastructure objective that we should find a way to achieve. I guess I would say the hope here is that if we have this service-based approach to universal service, that it actually will result in the deployment of infrastructure, and that infrastructure will be proximate enough to these anchor institutions you discuss. And it need not just be wired infrastructure being built for wired services. For instance, the expansion of cell towers into these rural areas is certainly going to result in the expansion of fiber networks that have the capability of delivering the kinds of performance you're discussing, you reference, a gigabit or higher. And hopefully a lot of those will be reasonably proximate to the kinds of institutions you're talking about. But realistically, that kind of secondary effect is really, to me, the most likely way that you get anything for that objective through this program.
And I guess I'd just like to add, I think in a lot of these rural communities, even if it's not at a gigabyte just yet, these anchor institutions are leaps and bounds ahead of whatever residential service is actually available. And I think one of the themes that's kind of come up in talking to different rural states and things like that, we've kind of seen that the problem really isn't so much access to the school. The problem is once these students actually step off the campus and try to go home and try to actually use a laptop or use something else at home, they just don't have service there. So I think focusing on providing that level of service through a high cost fund or a CAF fund, maybe that is the proper focus at this time. Later on, should there be maybe some sort of transition or additional program to help? Possibly, but I think you have to focus on one step at a time. And I think right now this is kind of this may be the right step to actually get access at home where students do homework and where that type of support might be needed.
It might be able to be viewed as a bit of a linear challenge. And if I'm envisioning a network build out and I build to an anchor institution, that doesn't necessarily spread the network out to the surrounding community. But if I'm building a network of infrastructure to the surrounding community, that can all be fed into a hub. Those spokes can be fed into the hub of an anchor institution, and that way I think you get both. I think if we had all the resources in the world, we probably wouldn't be sitting here this morning. The riddle is trying to do as much as we can with what is politically and what's realistically available, and how we balance those needs.
Yeah, if I could just respond briefly. There's actually lots of evidence that anchor institutions are not getting the broadband they need. There's a severe shortage of broadband for anchor institutions. But the thought was, if you're designing a new network, could the anchor institutions' needs be incorporated into the design of the network so it's not additional cost to serve them, it's just folded into the design phase?
I can't answer how that gets folded into the plan design. What I can say is that I do know, I actually had a meeting, I did have a meeting at the FCC recently with someone, and it's a small rural telephone company. They have one customer that gets 15 meg, and that's the local school. So within their network design, they've managed to get, whatever we get at home to the homes, but there is that 15 meg pipe going just to the school. So it does seem that there is a way to do it. And again, how do we craft that to make it, yeah.
All right, great. And it looks like we are just about out of time, but let me ask one more question before we wrap up. I'd like each of you to just briefly tell us what the most important consideration ought to be in moving forward. I know. The most important consideration in moving forward with these, with the transition to the Connect America Fund.
All right, I'll get to.
I'm going to put you on the hot seat first here, Russ.
Well, the most important consideration ought to be consumers, right? The most important consideration ought to be how do we get service that consumers want to consumers, whether it's the subsidized service or other service that's just entering the market. How do we make sure that consumers have the diversity of services they want, that they get the mobility that they want, they get the speed that they want, and how do we and without paying 15 or 20 or 25% on those phone bills.
And aside from consumers, I would say that it's pretty important for state governments and individual carriers to actually assess what the impact might be of CAF. As much as they may like it or dislike it, it's important to kind of get out in front of that. I think the winners are going to be the companies that actually do that and perform that work, but a lot of it goes back to the actual impact on the consumers, on the citizens within that state, on the quality of life there.
Get it done right. And let's make sure that whatever comes out preserves private capital incentives that, partnered with the federal support to be the stopgap measure, can build scalable networks that can be there for today and then built up again for tomorrow.
I would just go back to sort of my opening remarks, which I think the most important consideration is to ensure that the Universal Service Program is put within the context of this overall transition that we are in the process of, from narrowband analog networks to broadband digital networks, and to have, just the modicum of humility to say that we, the policymaker, we don't know what the perfect business model is for these networks, and we're not going to dictate a particular business model. We're just going to try to find the least intrusive way we can to provide the subsidy in those places where it's needed that's sufficient to cause a private capital to want to partner with that program.
I'd say the most important thing is for public policy to catch up with technology innovation, because right now public policy is based on landlines. We need to understand the importance of mobile and its growing impact, and then certainly the importance of broadband in terms of giving consumers the services that they want. So the policy needs to change just as the technology has changed.
Thank you, and I'm going to turn this back over to Sylvia, but before I do, please everybody give a big round of applause to our panelists today. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to our panelists. And before we end the program, I want to point to the back of your program. On September 20th, our next Broadband Breakfast Club. The topic is Making Cities of the Future Smarter Through Broadband. And our October Broadband Breakfast Club is Bringing Broadband Infrastructure to Rural Areas. Where is the progress? And I'd like to thank again our Broadband Breakfast Club sponsors, ICF International, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the Telecommunications Industry Association, and U.S. Telecom. Thank you all.